8:30 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Laner stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby, watching his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission that higher command had already labeled impossible. He was 31 years old, had flown 72 combat missions, and had sunk 0 ships. The Japanese had dispatched 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers from Rabaul, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce their garrison at La. American intelligence had intercepted the convoy's departure, and every transport that reached La meant another division the Allies would have to claw out of the jungle with blood. Laner's problem was straightforward. Conventional bombing from 10,000 feet gave ships too much warning. Japanese captains watched American bombers climb to altitude, calculated bomb trajectories, and simply turned their vessels away from the predicted splash zones. 5th Air Force B-17s had been attempting to hit Japanese convoys for 8 months, with a hit rate of just 3%. Most bombs detonated harmlessly in open ocean while the ship steamed on untouched. The math was unforgiving. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from altitude took 37 seconds to strike the water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer moving at 30 knots traveled 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. Bombardiers aimed where the ship was. The bomb landed where the ship used to be. Laner had watched it happen mission after mission. Bombers returned with pristine bombing photographs showing tight patterns around the ships, around them, never on them. Crews reported direct hits that later proved to be near misses. The Japanese kept sailing, and American bomber losses kept rising. His squadron had lost 4 aircraft in the past month trying to attack convoys, 40 men. Japanese gunners brought down high-altitude bombers with systematic precision. They had time to track the approach, compute lead, and bracket the formations with flak. By the time bombs fell, half the squadron was burning. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, had proposed something that sounded insane to every pilot who heard it. Skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. Fly in at 50 feet. Release the bomb 300 yards out with a 5-second delay fuse. Let momentum carry it into the ship's hull. The bomb would skip once, maybe twice, then explode on contact or just below the waterline. The theorists said it would work. The pilots said it was suicide. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet above ocean swells straight at a ship bristling with anti-aircraft guns violated every survival instinct Laner had developed. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm main guns, 25mm cannons, and dozens of lighter weapons, all capable of tracking a bomber at that altitude. One solid hit to an engine and the B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could blink. Higher command had banned the tactic twice, too dangerous, too experimental, and proven. Laner's requests to practice skip bombing had been denied in December and again in January. The official response called it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. Air crews were ordered to focus on proven high-altitude tactics. But high-altitude tactics were not sinking ships. Laner walked into the operations tent and spread reconnaissance photographs across the planning table. The Japanese convoy had been spotted at dawn, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea, 8 bulky transports in 2 columns. Destroyers screening the flanks, every ship packed with soldiers, artillery, and ammunition. If those transports reached La, the war in New Guinea would drag on for another year. He had an idea that would either validate Kenney's faith in low-altitude attack or get 60 American airmen killed before lunch. The convoy would pass within striking distance at 0900, 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly in ways they never had before. Laner summoned his squadron leaders and laid out the plan they had been forbidden to practice. The B-25 Mitchell was not designed for what Laner was demanding. It had been built to strike targets from medium altitude using a level bombing approach. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles per hour in level flight, but that speed meant nothing if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to track the approach. Kenney's modification changed everything. 5th Air Force mechanics had removed the bombardier's position in the nose and installed 8.50 caliber machine guns pointing forward, 4 in the nose and 4 in blister mounts along the fuselage sides. The B-25 had become a flying gun platform capable of pouring 200 rounds per second into a target. The concept was simple: suppress the ship's anti-aircraft fire during the approach, give the gunners a reason to duck, forced them to choose between shooting back and staying alive. Laner had watched the mechanics bolt the guns onto his aircraft 3 weeks earlier. The modification added 1,200 pounds and shifted the center of gravity forward. It transformed his bomber into something between an attack aircraft and a maritime strike fighter, something that had never existed before. Practice runs were conducted in secrecy. Kenney had located a wreck called the Pruth, a 700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nate Era Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged, an ideal target. Laner's crews flew practice attacks at dawn and dusk when visibility was poor and observers were few. They learned to skim the wave tops at 270 miles per hour. They learned to time the bomb release. They learned what happened when you got it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett got it wrong on February 16. He came in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb skipped twice, cleared the wreck entirely, and detonated 300 yards beyond it. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, recalculated, lower, faster, closer release. On the next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the wreck's hull just below the waterline, exactly where a ship's magazine would be, where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammunition and split a destroyer in half. But the wreck was not shooting back. Laner spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table and pointed to the lead transport 800 feet long, displacing 10,000 tons, capable of carrying 1,500 troops, the convoy's flagship. Every officer in the tent understood what was at stake. Japanese reinforcements had turned Buna into a 6-month nightmare that had cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh would be worse if those transports unloaded. The mathematics of skip bombing required precision most bomber crews had never attempted. Approach. Altitude 50 feet above the water. Approach speed 270 miles per hour. Release point 300 yards from target. Bomb trajectory angle 8 degrees. Delay fuse 5 seconds. Miss any one variable and the bomb would either skip over the ship, detonate short, or hit the water at the wrong angle and sink without detonating. Laner assigned each pilot a specific target. Transport 1 through Transport 8. Destroyers as secondary targets if the transports were already burning. No bomber would attack the same ship twice. Maximum efficiency, maximum destruction. One pass, one bomb, one chance. The crews filed out to their aircraft at 0700. 54 men in 9 B-25s. Behind them, 13 bow fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would strafe the convoy first, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Above them, 16 B-7 flying fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver and breaking up their formations. The P-38 Lightning fighters would keep Japanese Zeros busy at high altitude, but the killing blow would come from Laner's 9 bombers at 50 feet. He climbed into his aircraft at 0715. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already running through the pre-flight checklist. The bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was checking the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. Nobody spoke. The entire crew had flown together for 9 months. They knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They knew the odds. Laner started the port engine, then the starboard. The right cyclones caught and settled into their familiar roar. Around him, 8 other B-25s were winding up. The formation would take off in flights of 3. Laner's flight first. Stay low, over the water the entire way. Japanese radar couldn't track aircraft below 100. Foot surprise was the only advantage they had. At 0745, Laner released the brakes and began his takeoff roll. By 9:30, he would know if Kenny's theory worked or if he just led his entire squadron into a slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck took 90 minutes. Laner kept his formation at 30 feet above the ocean, low enough that spray from the wavetops occasionally spattered his windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V formation. Each aircraft separated by 200 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact. Far enough that one burst of flak couldn't take down 2 bombers. Radio silence. The Japanese monitored every frequency. One transmission and the convoy would know American bombers were inbound. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Laner checked his watch. 8:30, the convoy should be 60 miles northeast, steaming at 12 knots toward the VTZ Strait. Right on schedule, according to the morning reconnaissance report. The ocean below was empty. No white caps, no Japanese patrol boats, just endless blue water stretching to the horizon in every direction. Flying this low, Laner couldn't see more than 5 m. The convoy could be anywhere. His navigation had to be perfect, 5 degrees off course, and they'd missed the target entirely. Come up on the convoy from the wrong angle and the destroyers would have time to bring their main guns to bear. At 0852, Laner spotted smoke on the horizon, black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in formation. He keyed his throat microphone once, clicked the signal to tighten formation. His wingmen Acknowledged with single clicks. Radio discipline holding. The convoy took shape as they closed. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. The destroyers formed a protective screen 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Laner counted gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller weapons. Every gun would be tracking his approach once they broke the horizon. At 0857, the bow fighters went in. Laner watched from 3 miles out as 13 Australian aircraft dove on the convoy from the northeast. Their 20mm cannons rad the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. The bow fighters weren't there to sink ships, they were there to make the gunners look the wrong direction. 30 seconds later, the B-7S arrived at 10,000 feet. Laner saw the bomb bay doors open. Bombs tumbled toward the convoy. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard. Columns broke apart. Spacing increased. The destroyers accelerated to flank speed, white water foaming at their sterns. Confusion. Perfect. Laner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet. His airspeed dropped to 260 miles per hour. Walls, his bombardier, was calling out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Laner picked his target, the second transport in the port column, 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded. His bomb would hit amidships, right where the troop compartments were packed with soldiers. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Laner saw muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward his formation, too high. The Japanese gunners were used to tracking bombers at altitude. They hadn't adjusted for a 50-foot approach yet. At 2,000 yards, Laner opened fire. All 8-caliber machine guns hammered. Tracers walked across the transports. Super rupture. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews couldn't shoot back, while half-in bullets were tearing through their positions at 800 rounds per minute. 1,200 yards, Laner's wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. The formation was fragmenting by design. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for the defenders to shift fire. No time to coordinate a response. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired. Again. This time, the shells bracketed Laner's flight. Left, right, close enough to rock the aircraft with concussion. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Ben, the co-pilot, called out, damage. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still in the green. 600 yards. The transport filled Laner's windscreen. He could see individual soldiers on deck scrambling for cover. Could see the bridge windows. Could see the ship's gun crews swinging their weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to climb, to get away from the wall of steel rushing toward him at a combined closing speed of 300 miles per hour. 400 yards, Waltz's voice cut through the engine roar. Bomb armed, ready for release. 300 yards, Laner pressed the bomb release. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum. It hit the water nose first, skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed toward the transport's hull. Laner pulled hard on the control yoke and climbed behind him. The 5-second fuse was counting down. The bomb detonated at the water line. Laner didn't see the explosion. He was climbing hard, his vision filled with sky, but he felt it. The shockwave hit his aircraft like a physical blow, lifting the tail and throwing the B-25 sideways. Benz fought the controls. The altimeter spun through 100 feet, 200, 300. Laner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The hull buckled. Metal shrieked. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship listed to port, already taking water through the massive hole torn in its side. Soldiers were jumping overboard. Dozens of them, tiny figures, abandoning a dying ship. One bomb 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. The skip bombing worked. To Laner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett's bomber was pulling up from its own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Bill Hayes had just released on a destroyer. The bomb skipped twice and hit below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted out of the water from the internal explosion. When it crashed back down, the entire rear third of the ship was missing. The destroyer began settling by the stern, sinking fast. 4 targets hit in the first 90 seconds. The Japanese convoy was in chaos, but the defenders were adapting. A destroyer on the far flank had turned to face the bombers. Its main guns fired in rapid succession. The shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards. The second by 20, the third hit Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated. The bomb under the fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion vaporized the bomber instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. 5 men gone between one heartbeat and the next. Laner watched the debris scatter across the water. No time to process it. No time to mourn. The attack was still happening. The remaining B-25s pressed their attacks. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the convoy flagship. His approach was textbook. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour, machine guns blazing. The Japanese crew was firing back with everything they had. 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between Johnson's bomber and the transport was solid with tracers. Johnson's bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and punched through the transport's hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion tore through 3 decks. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. Laner knew what was in those holds: ammunition, artillery shells, fuel drums. The transport became an inferno. Men were burning on deck, jumping into the sea, trailing smoke. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took hits during its approach. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally adjusted for the low altitude attack. 20mm shells ripped through Warren's port wing. Fuel streamed from the punctured tank. Warren held his course. 300 yards, 200. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, was already activating the fire suppression system. The flames died. The bomber was still flying barely. 6 transports burning or sinking. 2 destroyers damaged, 1 B-25 lost. The attack had lasted 4 minutes. The second wave was coming in. 9 more B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chell. They'd watched Laner's attack from 5 miles out. They knew the tactic worked. They knew the cost. Chell's formation spread out, each bomber selecting a target from the ships still afloat. The Japanese were ready this time. Every gun in the convoy was tracking low. The destroyers had formed a defensive line, their main batteries firing in coordinated volleys. The ocean erupted with shell splashes. The barrage was intense, deadly, calculated. The Japanese had learned from the first attack they would make the Americans pay for the second. Chell's bomber came in from the east, directly into the sun. Smart. The Japanese gunners were half blind, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing. The explosion accelerated the sinking. The ship rolled onto its side and went under. In less than 2 minutes, 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach angle was wrong. Too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and circled for another run. The Japanese destroyer he'd missed tracked him the entire turn. When Jensen came around for his second pass, the destroyer was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 mph. No explosion, just impact. The ocean swallowed the aircraft and kept moving. 2 bombers down, 7 transports sinking, 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes, and Laner realized with cold clarity that the Japanese still had 60 fighters, somewhere above the clouds. The Zeros appeared at 9:15, 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. Laner saw them through scattered clouds, silver shapes dropping toward the bombers like hawks on field mice. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to keep them occupied. Something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings were outnumbered or the Japanese had committed a second fighter group nobody knew about. Laner's B-25 was vulnerable, low on fuel, low on ammunition. The machine guns in his nose had maybe 200 rounds left, not enough for a sustained dogfight, not enough to hold off a determined Zero pilot who'd learned to respect American bombers the hard way. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to wavetop high 20 feet 15. The propellers were churning salt spray. The Zeros split into two groups. Half stayed high to engage the P-38s. The other 9 went after the bombers. They came in fast, 400 miles per hour, firing their 20 cannons from 1,000 yards out. Laner saw tracers arc past his canopy. Too close, he jinked left, then right, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake was in the dorsal gun turret, firing short, controlled bursts at the nearest Zero. The Japanese fighter broke off. Not damaged, just cautious. Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber wasn't so lucky. Azaro latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew. Climbs, dives, hard, banking turns that stressed his damaged wing. Nothing worked. The Zero pilot was good, patient. He waited until Warren ran out of airspeed in a climbing turn, then fired a two-con burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over and went into the ocean. Laner saw 3 parachutes, 3 out of 5. Better than nothing. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 minutes. Then abruptly, they broke off and climbed. Laner couldn't figure it out until he saw why. The B-7S were coming back for a second pass at 10,000 feet. The Zeros had to choose: attack the bombers below or defend the convoy from above. They chose above. The heavy bombers were the bigger threat to what remained of the convoy. Laner used the reprieve to assess damage. His port engine was running rough, oil pressure fluctuating, fuel gauge showing 60%, enough to make it back to Port Moresby, maybe. He looked back at the convoy. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The 8th was burning but still afloat, trying to make way toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screening line were damaged. 2 were dead in the water. The other 2 were circling the burning transports trying to pick up survivors. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over. It was 0921. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes, but the killing would continue for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt survivors in lifeboats. The Japanese had committed 7,000 troops to this convoy. Fewer than 200 would make it to lay. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure in the tropical sun. Laner set course for home. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost. 20 men dead or missing. But the mission had worked. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal way possible. The technique would be refined, standardized, taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon any attempt to move large convoys within range of Allied air power. The supply line to their forward bases would strangle. The war would turn, but LNER didn't know that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. He ordered his crew to dump everything not essential. Ammunition, guns, they couldn't use, tools, spare parts, anything to reduce weight. The B-25 was struggling to maintain altitude with one engine running rough. At 010, Ben spotted land, the southern coast of New Guinea. They were on course barely. The port engine was shaking now, oil streaming from a crack in the housing, temperature gauge climbing into the red. 5 more minutes and it would seize completely. Laner feathered the port propeller and transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed, just enough to stay airborne. The coast was getting closer. 40 M3020. The engine held. Laner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, intelligence officers. Word had spread. The convoy had been hit hard. Nobody knew how hard. Laner cut the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the control yoke, then was silent beside him. Neither man moved. They'd been flying for 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like 3 days. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Lehner and his surviving pilots sat in the operations tent while intelligence officers asked the same questions in different ways. How many ships hit? How many sinking? How many bombs released? How many aircraft lost? The officers were building a picture from fragments. 9 pilots had attacked. 5 had returned. Mitchell gone. Jensen gone. Warren in the water. His crew picked up by a Catalina flying boat. 2 men wounded. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. An Australian Balfour had photographed the convoy from 15,000 feet. At noon, the images told the story Lerner's crew couldn't. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking, the 8th beat on the New Britain coast. Burning, 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 severely damaged, and withdrawing toward Rabble. Total time, from first attack to last ship down, 3 hours. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby at 1,600 hours. He walked directly to the operations tent and spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table. He didn't congratulate anyone, didn't shake hands. He pointed at the burning transport beached on the coast and said, "Finish it." The Australian bow fighters would make another run at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Leh. Nothing. The second strike launched at 1730. Lehner didn't fly. His bomber needed a new engine. Instead, he stood on the runway and watched 9 fresh B-25s take off into the setting sun. They'd be over the target at dusk. The Japanese survivors would be trying to salvage what they could from the beach to transport. They wouldn't expect another attack. They'd be wrong. The strike returned at 2,000 hours. The beach transport was gone, sunk at its mooring. The 2 damaged destroyers had been caught trying to withdraw, both hit, both sinking. The Japanese had started this operation with 16 ships. By nightfall on March 2, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabble at midnight, barely afloat. The cost in lives was catastrophic. 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabat. Reconnaissance flights over the next 2 days counted approximately 900 survivors reaching the New Britain coast. By lifeboat or swimming, American PT boats intercepted most of the lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued, others were killed in the water. The distinction between combat and massacre blurred in. Those 3 days, command ordered no quarter. The Japanese had machine-gunned American air crew and parachutes. The Americans returned the favor to soldiers and lifeboats. Lehner learned about it 3 days later. He didn't ask for details, didn't want to know which PT boat crews had fired on lifeboats, which bomber crews had strafed survivors swimming for shore. The war had rules until it didn't. The rules had stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last Japanese transport going under. Nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote it in after-action reports. It happened anyway. The final count came through on March 7. The Japanese losses: 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 troops drowned. Another 1,500 killed by air attack. 1,200 reached Lele overland through the jungle. They arrived without weapons, without supplies, without organization. They were combat ineffective. The reinforcement operation had failed completely. American losses: 4 B-25s, 1 B-7, 2 P-38s, 13 air crew killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was absurdly one-sided. Skip bombing had worked, but it had worked because Lerner's crews had been willing to fly straight at destroyers at 50 feet, while anti-aircraft fire turned the air into metal. Courage didn't cover it. Insanity was closer. Kenny called it the most decisive air-sea battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster. The Japanese Navy immediately cancelled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was cut. The garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and Madon would have to survive on what they had. They wouldn't survive long. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed more than Japanese strategy. It changed how every air force in the world thought about attacking ships. The Americans refined skip bombing. The British adopted it. The Soviets copied it. By 1944, low-altitude bombing had become standard doctrine for maritime strike aircraft worldwide. Lehner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May. He never spoke publicly about the battle, never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir. He'd done what was necessary. That was enough. The question nobody could answer was simple. Would the same tactic work against a prepared enemy? The Japanese tested that question 3 months later. On June 3, 1943, American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports, 8 destroyers. This time the Japanese ship sailed at night. This time they had 60 Zero fighters providing continuous air cover. This time, every destroyer carried additional 20mm anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to defend against low-altitude attacks. They'd learned from the Bismarck Sea. They'd adapted. The 5th Air Force attacked at dawn, 12 B-25s using skip bombing. The results were different. 2 transports hit, 1 destroyer damaged, 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. The Japanese anti-aircraft defense had improved dramatically. Gunners who'd survived the Bismarck Sea had trained their replacements. They knew to track low. They knew to fire early. They knew to concentrate on the bombers during the final approach when the aircraft were committed and couldn't maneuver. The Americans adapted in return. By July, 5th Air Force mechanics had installed additional armor around the cockpit and engines. They'd increased the forward-firing armament to 1250 caliber machine guns. Some B-25s carried 14 guns. The theory remained the same: suppressed defensive fire with overwhelming firepower during the approach. Give the enemy gunners no choice except take cover or die. The modification worked. On November 2, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor in the largest skip bombing raid of the war. The harbor contained 18 warships, 30 received direct hits, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 2 auxiliary vessels destroyed, 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. The raid lasted 18 minutes. American losses, 2 B-25s. The exchange rate had swung back in America's favor, but Rabaul proved something else. Skip bombing worked best against ships in confined waters, ships that couldn't maneuver freely, ships anchored in harbor or trapped in narrow straits. Against a convoy in open ocean, with room to maneuver and fighter cover overhead, the tactic was dangerous. Against ships at anchor, it was devastating. The British adopted skip bombing in late 1943, Royal Air Force BAU fighters equipped with the technique attacked German convoys off Norway. The results mirrored the Pacific experience: high casualties, high success rate. The Germans responded by adding more anti-aircraft guns to their merchant vessels and requiring convoys to sail only under heavy fighter escort. The cost of moving supplies by sea increased dramatically. The effectiveness decreased proportionally. The Soviets used skip bombing against German ships in the Black Sea and Baltic. Their technique was cruder, lower approach altitude, heavier bombs, less suppressive fire. The results were mixed. Some ships sunk. Many bombers lost. The Soviets had courage. They lacked the training and equipment refinement the Americans had developed through trial and error in the Pacific. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved beyond its original form. American tactics now included coordinated attacks. High-altitude bombers would attack first, forcing ships to maneuver. Fighters would strafe to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then the skip bombers would come in low while the defenses were distracted and disorganized. The multi-layered approach reduced losses while maintaining effectiveness. The statistics told the story. Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese Vessels. The cost was 47 bombers lost. A kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber. For comparison, high-altitude bombing achieved a kill ratio of just 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing proved 15 times more effective. Yet the human toll was harder to measure. Skip bombing required crews to fly directly at vessels bristling with weapons, holding a steady course while tracers streaked through the sky around them. The psychological strain was immense. Pilots who flew skip bombing sorties endured shorter combat tours, higher levels of battle fatigue, and more frequent medical groundings for stress-related conditions. The tactic was effective, but it also broke the men who executed it. Lehner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. He trained new crews, watched them take off on missions using the method he had helped validate, and endured the sight of some not returning. By the war's end, he had trained 62 pilots in skip bombing, 18 were killed in action, and 23 wounded. The mathematics were unforgiving. A 29% fatality rate, 66% casualty rate including the wounded, better than high-altitude bombing, worse than almost any other combat aviation role. Military historians would debate for decades whether skip bombing had shortened the war. The answer was complex. Skip bombing did not win battles single-handedly, but it choked Japanese supply lines, made reinforcements prohibitively costly, and forced the Japanese Navy to abandon large-scale convoy operations. Without supplies, garrisons decayed. Without reinforcements, defensive positions collapsed. The islands fell one by one. What was certain, however, was this: on March 2 and 3, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers flying at 50 feet had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes of continuous combat. The tactic had been banned twice, dismissed as suicide by everyone who heard of it, yet proved effective by men willing to fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire because the alternative was allowing 7,000 enemy soldiers to reach their destination. The bombers that attacked the Bismarck Sea convoy were scrapped after the war. None survived as museum pieces. Major Ed Lehner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old. He had flown 88 combat missions and survived longer than most bomber pilots in the Pacific. The Army Air Force wanted him to train new crews, pass on the techniques that had worked. He refused. Lehner requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft. He spent the rest of the war piloting C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat, no skip bombing, no more missions where he watched crews he trained die in aircraft he had taught them to fly. He never explained the decision, nor had he to. Command understood. Some men could continue flying combat after witnessing such carnage. Others could not. There was no shame in either choice. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943, declining twice before finally accepting. He sought no recognition, only to finish the war and return home. He got his wish in September 1945. Japan surrendered. Lehner mustered out 3 months later, decorated with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he had never reported in any after-action account. Lehner passed away in 1997 in Sacramento, California, at 85. His obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It did not reference the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, skip bombing, or his role in developing a tactic that changed naval warfare. He had instructed his family not to discuss it, and they honored his request. General George Kenney received credit for skip bombing in most historical accounts. That was fine with Lehner. Kenney had conceived the theory, Lehner had proven it worked. The distinction mattered to historians, but not to the pilots who flew the missions. They knew who led the first attack. They knew who trained them. They knew whose techniques kept them alive as Japanese gunners tracked their approach at 50 feet. The B-25 Mitchell bomber became legendary partly because of skip bombing. It served in every theater of World War II, but its reputation was forged in the Pacific, flying missions that seemed unsurvivable. By war's end, B-25s had sunk more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique Lehner and his crews had validated in March 1943 became standard doctrine for every B-25 unit in the Pacific. No museum displays a B-25 specifically flown in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The aircraft were worn out by the war's end, most scrapped for aluminum. A few survive in museums, restored to flight or displayed as static exhibits. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has a B-25 Mitchell, so does the Smithsonian. Neither flew at the Bismarck Sea, but both represent the crews who did. The battle itself is largely forgotten outside military history circles. It lacks the name recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. No major films dramatized it. No famous photographs captured the moment. Only after-action reports, reconnaissance photos, and testimonies of men who mostly chose silence remain. What remains is this: in March 1943, a group of American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50 feet altitude. The tactic was called suicide before it worked, genius afterward. The truth lay somewhere between desperation meeting innovation. Men willing to try something untested because tested methods had failed. Courage measured by the decision to maintain heading while anti-aircraft fire turned the air lethal. The Pacific War changed after the Bismarck Sea. Japanese convoys stopped sailing within Allied air power range. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons starved. Islands fell. The war moved closer to Japan one island at a time, and the Japanese Navy could not prevent it because forward positions could not be resupplied. Skip bombing had not won the war alone, but it had severed the supply routes Japan needed to continue fighting. If this story moved you as it moved us, do us a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Drop a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community spans the globe. You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if a family member served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring Ed Lehner and his crews do not fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.